In this video, I'll be going over every single trap that is sitting on your waiver wire right now that you need to be avoiding at all costs, because there are a ton that will ruin your bench. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video, because I will give you the #1 biggest trap at the end, as well as a group of players that we can drop. They're safe to get off your roster. If you appreciate the waiver wire trap videos that nobody else posts, go ahead and hit that subscribe button or like the video. It helps me out a ton, does a lot for me as a person, but I don't like to waste people's time. The first trap of this video is going to be Noah Brown of the Commanders. This might be a little bit controversial, I get that. Last week, pretty good game. He led the team in targets with 10, finished with 6 receptions in that matchup, 71 yards, 13.1 fantasy points against the Cowboys defense that isn't amazing, but it also isn't bad either. So respect to him for that. But there is room in this Commanders offense for there to be a wide receiver too. There's really nobody else outside of Terry McLaurin and maybe Zach Ertz to take targets from. The majority of the reason Brown saw an increased number of targets and just usage in general is because they were playing the Cowboys. And in that matchup, historically, Terry McLaurin just gets outside of these games. It doesn't necessarily produce, kind of gets locked up if we're being honest. Outside of that almost game-tying touchdown that he scored at the end of the game, he only had 4 receptions for 16 yards. That's not necessarily amazing. The Cowboys historically have taken him out of these games, forcing other guys to be more involved, aka him and Zach Ertz and maybe the running backs as well. So outside of this game and the fortunate Hail Mary that he did catch in week 8, he's averaging 5 fantasy points a game. It's just not necessarily consistent. Even if you want to add him for a roster spot, a fill-in guy, a lot of buys are coming up, but they get a matchup here in this week against the Titans, who are bottom 5 in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, and then they get a bye week in week 14, so it's not the best situation there. Another wide receiver, though, we do need to be leaving on the waiver wire for everybody else is Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, another trap coming into week 13. This man is on an absolute touchdown streak. He's had 6 in his last 7 games, putting up 12.8 fantasy points last week against the Texans. There's no denying that his fantasy numbers are good, but you look at the touchdowns, it's wild. He's extremely touchdown dependent. Last week, he had 2 receptions, 48 yards, and a touchdown. That's pretty decent, but that's about what he's been seeing for the whole season. Nothing's really changed. He gets an average of 2 receptions a game, and when you look at last week, a game where the Titans put up 32 points in total, Will Levis has 24 pass attempts, Westbrook-Ikhine still only has 5 targets. There's less than a 20% team target share. There's really no value there. And you look at him and say, okay, well, not every wide receiver in the NFL has to be a volume guy. We've seen guys like Rashid Shaheed be very valuable, deep downfield presence that they do have. But if you're not going to have the targets, it's a requirement that the underlying statistics follow the kind of role that you have. Now, when you look at him, he's not really seeing those 2 connections. He's still not inside the top 60 wide receivers in air yards per game. The route participation isn't necessarily the greatest either. But if you can't see more than 2 receptions in a game, the risk is just going to be insane. He will be touchdown or bust. Tyler Boyd is going to be on this list as well if for some reason you do want to add him. 6 receptions for 55 yards last week, 11.5 fantasy points. That's decent. That's not going to continue though. Again, this offense isn't great. Their pass volume isn't amazing on a given week basis. He's only averaging a 12.6 team target share for the entire year, so that's not going to get it done. And he's not a vertical threat wide receiver like Westbrook-Ikhine is, so he is a guy that does rely on that target volume that he's not going to get. But a tight end, if we do look for that, Noah Gray is going to be a guy we cannot be adding. He's been seeing a lot of increase of value as far as waiver wire ads and trends go for the last 2 weeks. I know the tight end position is terrible. The pool is not there, but we don't need to be looking this deep into tight end too. He got the #1 most favorable matchup last week against the Panthers, where he finished with 4 receptions for 66 yards and 22.6 fantasy points. That is amazing. He put together a decent stretch over the last 2 weeks as well. If you look at his chart here, he has 4 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks and a decent target share, snap percentage as well to go along with that. So it looks like maybe he could provide some value for us. But the Chiefs offense is definitely one of the best. It's one where you want to grab bits and pieces from, but we can't be grabbing a tight end if you have Travis Kelce as your #1 main receiving option, not even main receiving tight end in this offense. Yes, he might be taking a step back. He is getting a little bit older, but we look at Noah Gray. He's a tight end 33 in routes run per game at 15.9 routes. That's just not going to get it done, especially when you don't have the opportunity for a high target share. That's shown at an 8.7% for the year. That's not great either. He does get another great matchup here against the Raiders in week 13, but the touchdowns are going to dip. He has 4 in 2 weeks. That's not consistent. Leave him on the waiver wire and possibly pick up a different tight end like Will Dissly or some of the other guys I talk about in my waiver wire video. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. I will pin it in the card up at the top of the video if you do want to see that. But speaking of tight ends we need to avoid, Austin Hooper is another guy that 100% fits the criteria to leave on the waiver wire. The Patriots offense is nothing short of confusing and honestly just inefficient. They're 10th in passing attempts but 27th in yards per game. The offense is 32nd ranked in the NFL. It's not good, but somehow he's managed to find some kind of consistency for the season. He's averaging 10.9 fantasy points per game over his last 3 isolated. Yes, the fantasy points may be there. He's averaging just under 4 receptions and 52 yards per game in that 3-week stretch. That's honestly pretty good, but the underlying numbers don't prove this to be consistent and be able to continue for the rest of the year, even in the next few weeks stretch. He's a tight end 30 in target share, the tight end 35 in air yards per game, and the tight end 40 in route participation. Hunter Henry is existing in this offense. That's honestly the number one red flag for him. Similar to the Noah Gray situation, you have another tight end splitting snaps that also runs routes. A lot of teams deploy 2 tight end sets all the time, but most of them, they have the tight end running routes and the other one blocking. When you have 2 tight ends running routes consistently, it's not going to be enough opportunity for the second tight end to actually get usage in fantasy football and be viable. He's seeing less than 50% of the snaps. As long as Hunter Henry is here, that's not going to increase to that level. But Demarcus Robinson, if you're looking for a wide receiver, is a guy that will not be the answer for you. Here is the data behind it. Obviously, he's the wide receiver 3, clearly behind these guys in the offense. But unlike some of the other guys in this list of players, he does actually have a good offense behind him. He put up 9.5 fantasy points last week. Not a bad number by any means, but that came off 3 targets for only 2 receptions, 15 yards, and a touchdown. That's just not going to get it done. We've seen that he's had pretty good games in previous weeks, but with Cooper Kupp healthy, with Puka healthy, you can't expect any kind of consistency as far as target share goes. He does see a little bit of usage deep downfield, but all of the wide receivers in this offense do that as well. Last week, he saw an 8% team target share. That is horrific. He's averaging 10% on the year. That's also including the games where starters were healthy and also injured. It's just not going to be consistent enough. Those numbers, time and time again, prove that he's not going to be worth a roster spot for you. There's no reason he should already be rostered in 32% of leagues still. This is a guy that's the wide receiver 30 in air yards, the wide receiver 42 in route participation. There's just no opportunity for him here, and he does have some tougher matchups against wide receiver points allowed with the Saints, the Bills, 49ers, and Jets in his next 3. So even in deeper leagues, you don't need to be rostering it. But the number one trap coming into week 13, do not put a waiver claim on this guy. I do not care how deep your league is, how shallow it is. David Moore needs to be left on the waiver wire for you here. He is a very, very big trap. He put up 20.1 fantasy points last week. That's awesome. And he did it against one of the toughest, if not the toughest defense in the entire NFL in the Chiefs, allowing some of the least points to wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, everything except tight ends, but that's besides the point. Let alone he did that in a game where the Panthers actually saw a ton of success, and they ended up losing by a field goal, which is actually impressive for this team. And they've found some light over the last few weeks. They're averaging 21 points a game over their last 4, but still, that is not going to be good enough to make David Moore a guy we need to be adding. His numbers and his snap percentage has drastically increased ever since the Deontay trade, another plus for him. He's averaging about 85% of the snaps because of that. Now, last week he comes out breaking out for a touchdown, 6 receptions, 81 yards, 10 targets, leading the team. Again, impressive numbers. That's a 30% team target share. That's what's even more impressive about this, with the inclusion of the first game back for Adam Thielen and obviously Xavier Legette. But there's your answer right there. There's too many options, too much target competition in this offense, especially when we also get Jalen Coker back. That's 4 wide receivers, including him, that are averaging above 50% of the snaps. Now, he does get a good matchup against the Buccaneers here in Week 13. They allow some of the most points to wide receivers this year, but that's another reason why he's been moving up the trends in the waiver wire. That doesn't matter. He's the wide receiver 3 in this offense, and that's being a little bit generous. He still doesn't have enough of a role to be supported. This team is 32 in passing yards, 20th in passing attempts. That shows you the inefficiency there. Yes, last week was great, but I do not expect that to be any kind of consistent in this offense, especially when you have Bryce Young at quarterback, even if the team is looking a little bit better as of late. But now for a list of players that are 100% safe to drop. If you have them on your roster, get them off right now, make some room. And if you don't have these guys on your team, let me know in the comments who you're considering dropping, and I'll let you know if it is worthwhile for you. But the first guy here is going to be Alec Pierce. He doesn't have a consistent, predictable target share, especially now that we have Anthony Richardson back into this offense. Nothing is good. It's just a mix of bad. Dontavian Wicks is another guy here. He can be dropped. There are too many wide receiver options in this Packers offense. You can't trust them. You can barely trust the top guys in Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, and Christian Watson, if you want to call them that. Amir Abdullah can also be dropped here. He was a fine fill-in for Alexander Madison and Zamir White when they were injured. They should be returning here. And even now, last week we saw when they were out, it is a little bit more of a 2 RB system. Rashad Bateman can also be dropped. I am recording this before the Monday night game with the Chargers and the Ravens. Even if he does pop off, I'm still going to continue to have him on this list. I don't trust him. Gesicki also needs to be dropped. We've seen time and time again when T. Higgins is healthy in this offense, Gesicki gets absolutely nothing. And for whatever reason, if you are holding Luke Shoemaker or Devin Singletary, drop them off your roster. I saw that their roster percentage was way higher than it should be. That's going to finish off this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the stash video coming tomorrow, and all glory to the man above.